Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey peeps, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Kate Nicholson to discuss her recently published book, Behind Everest. The book investigates the life and legacy of Ruth Mallory, the wife of famed British mountaineer George Mallory. This is a bit of a departure from my usual fare in that I generally stick to United States history, but I always enjoy learning about the women behind the quote-unquote great men in history, and decided to make an exception. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so apologies ahead of time for any dips in audio quality. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Kate Nicholson. She is a historian and writer who is here to discuss her latest book, Behind Everest, Ruth Mallory's Story, which explores the experiences and life of Ruth Mallory, wife of famed mountaineer George Mallory. Welcome, Kate.
Hello. Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive right in. How did you come about discovering Ruth Mallory as someone worthy of researching?
The reason that I found Ruth Mallory is because my husband climbed Everest by the same route as George Mallory. So when George climbed in 1921, he had 3 children, a baby and 2 slightly older. And when my husband climbed by the same route in 2006, our children were precisely the same age as the Mallory's children. And so I discovered Ruth because I wanted to see how the experts had done it, how she'd managed. Because having very young children somebody described it the other day as hardcore. I mean, it is hard work. 3 moving targets. My oldest 2 are boys. It was really busy. And then somebody, the co-partner, the co-parent, goes somewhere and does something which is very dangerous. And it's a very difficult thing to resolve in your mind, because in both of our cases, in Ruth and mine, we'd married somebody who was adventurous. That's part of the attraction. And you can't expect them to completely switch off. But we're 100 years apart, almost exactly. So it's just quite interesting seeing what's changed and what is the same. But I really like history. I always have. And I hope this is okay to say on your podcast, but if I'm speaking to people who have history as a hobby, this is how I feel about history. I feel so strongly about it that it's almost like a form of therapy for me. Mm. So I did children all day from the minute they wake up at about 6 o'clock until I say, this is it, adult time now at 8 p.m. And at 8 p.m., I jump on my computer and I start researching Ruth Mallory. And it's grown-up time and a completely different headspace. And it's sort of an escape. It's a wonderful thing. And also, in The Martian, the film The Martian, when Matt Damon gets left on Mars, which gives you an idea about how hard I found this, he gets left on Mars and his fellow teammates are flying back to Earth thinking that he's dead. And so he looks around and he thinks, what am I going to do? And he's a scientist. And so he says, I'm just going to science out of it. He's going to survive. And in my case, because history is my hobby and I love history, I just thought, right, I'm going to history it out of it. And so that's what I did. And that's how Ruth Mallory came about.
I love that. Well, and even broadly speaking, right, history helps us kind of contextualize our present. And so it makes perfect sense that, if you're a lover of history and a historian by hobby, if not by trade, that you would look to the past to see, okay, other people have done this before. How did they survive? So that is a fascinating introduction into how you discovered Ruth Mallory.
It's not terribly sort of salubrious way of doing it, but it really worked for me and I recommend it to anybody else.
And you start by saying that Ruth Mallory is invisible. And so what made her invisible and how do you hope your book will change that?
Yes, I really hope my book will change that. Various things made her invisible. part of the reason was voluntary. I mean, I can almost blame Ruth for it because, an middle up class woman in England was expected to be deferent and slightly behind her husband and put his priorities first. So part of it is her kind of being that kind of wife. And the reason I want to change her being invisible is because until I started researching it, nobody knew that she was a very accomplished climber in her own right. Seems incredible, but a book out this year on Everest doesn't even mention her climbing. I
Mm.
can't believe it. But she was a founder member of the Pinnacle Club, which is the first all-female climbing club in the UK. And in order to be a founder member of that club, you have to be able to lead climbs. And she had not only led, but she'd done a first ascent. So I want her to be very visible as a pioneering female climber, quite apart from everything else.
And you craft your book in what I found to be a incredibly creative and a fascinating way, where you focus each chapter on various pieces of primary sources and then build out your analysis from there. So, what inspired you to format your analysis that way?
Yes, well, very good question. Okay, so Kate Nicholson is actually a pen name, and I have written a book before called Snow Widows under my real name, which is Catherine McInnes. And in that book, it had just under 1,000 references, footnotes. And still people say to me, because my style for that book was creative nonfiction, so it's writing it like a novel, but it is nonfiction. And people say to me, is it nonfiction? And I think, look at the references. There are 1,000 of them. And so I thought, right, what the problem is that these are at the back of the book. So what I need to do is put them at the front of the bit of writing you're going to read. And so for Snow Widows, I imagine it like a building. It's like a glazed high-rise building where you can't see any of the services, the stairs, the elevators. You just see the sheer outside edited building. Whereas for this book, it's like the Pompidou Center in Paris, where the staircases and the lifts are on the outside and all the air conditioning, and you see all the services on the outside of the thing. So hopefully that will lead you into the piece. So whether I write it as in the form of a novel or not, you can see the information that I'm using to create the nonfiction piece.
Yeah, it struck me every time I turned into a new chapter. I was like, oh, okay, this is what we're going to be looking at, and this is what's going to drive this narrative. And it was so incredibly compelling.
Oh, I'm so glad because sometimes I use a letter, and the letters in this book are so incredible. I mean, one of them has been archived on Everest, for goodness sake. It was found on George Mallory's body in his inside pocket. And I've held that letter in the
Mm,
Pepys Library in Cambridge, and it's perfect. You would think that it had been sent yesterday. Isn't that
wow.
incredible? So that kind of thing, I want to give you the feeling of heft and touch and texture to the history, because I love it when you can use primary sources. In fact, I really only want to use primary sources. I don't want to refer to people who have already written about Everest. I want to go right back to the original sources. So there's letters, and also there's a big rock called the Snuff Box, which is in a garden in Cornwall where Ruth lived eventually. And so one of the pieces of evidence is that big rock. So I kind of use lots of different types of evidence to try and layer up the story,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, put you in the picture.
It was very, very well done. I just can't say enough about how, and for me, it was, I had never really seen a book put together that way. So it was also
I've
like
never
just,
seen a book put together that way, but it is honestly in reaction because I've done a lot of Snow Widows talks now, and people say to me, is this really nonfiction? And I just thought, right, nobody's going to ask me that about this book.
And so this book is about Ruth and George, and it's this relationship and this tug and pull, and during their relationship, one of the biggest conflicts, international conflicts, happened. So, how did World War One influence and impact George and Ruth's marriage?
Well, it's very interesting because George was a risk taker. He said that climbing would lose its allure without the spice of danger. Um, and so he confessed to a friend of his, not to Ruth, that actually he found the idea of going to war quite exciting. It would be a form of adventure. Um, but he was a teacher, and at the time in Britain, um, teachers were in a protected profession because we had to teach the next generation. There had to be people coming through, as it were. And so his headmaster refused to allow him to sign up. And so he could have stayed in perfect safety in the classroom, but he felt guilty because even some of his pupils had graduated and signed up and been killed. So there's this really difficult conflict where he could be safe. They have one child, plans for more, but he elected to sign up, and eventually his headmaster let him. And so Ruth, one of her chief characteristics was this almost excruciating honesty, like almost a Tourette's honesty. And she said, I've always been afraid that you would sign up. I've always been afraid that you would want to. But now you're going to. I want you to be courageous. And, it was a form of duty. She realized it was the right thing to do. The thing that I find interesting about that is that she had no sort of conflict in her mind about the rightness of him fighting. But he then perceived Everest in a similar kind of way as a duty, to his country. And that isn't as clear. Going to war to fight for your country is one thing, but going to represent your country on a dangerous expedition is different. So that was the essential balance in that relationship of types of danger, because the whole book is themed about her reaction to danger. And she could easily understand that he wanted to go to war. It was more difficult to understand him wanting to go to Everest.
And you've mentioned the Pinnacle Club before. So what was it, and how did that impact Ruth's connection with climbing?
Yes. Well, Ruth had just climbed with George to start with. She was a really excellent climber because nowadays, if you learn to climb, you probably learn inside on a climbing wall. You have your top roped, which means you're held on from the top. So if you fall, you only fall so far. You have a helmet, you have rubber climbing shoes. They're all, and big squashy mats at the bottom. And so it's an entirely different risk thing, becoming, a learner climber now. When Ruth climbed, you just went to a crag and started climbing. But she was so good, such a natural climber, that she climbed many of the classic climbs in the British Lake District on her first week climbing with George. So she was already considered to be a very good climber. But when she was invited to be a member of the Pinnacle Club, she then had to write a list of all the routes she had climbed, because in order to apply, you needed to have a certain kind of career in climbing. And so, amazingly enough, as I was in the process of writing this book, the archivist at the Pinnacle Club found that list, which is amazing. So I not only know the crags she climbed, I know which route she picked up it, the direct line. So it's quite amazing to be able to climb somebody's route. You're putting your fingers where they had to have their fingers, because there aren't any other options on that route. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's an opportunity for you to really kind of live through your historical subject.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I've been hanging on a rock in the Lake District, a rock called Pillar. And, there's a 1,000-foot drop behind you. And it was quite extraordinary, actually, because I was on this ledge halfway up it, and I suddenly felt Ruth. And I'm not very ghosty at all, but I definitely felt that she was there. And until that point on that climb, I'd been really struggling to work out how to climb it. And I'd had to kind of ask my leader quite a few times, how did you get up there? How did you do it? And from that moment that I felt Ruth's presence kind of on the bit of rock that I was hanging on, I just went up it. I don't even really remember doing it. I didn't have to look for handholds or footholds.
Oh, wow.
It was all good. But yeah, she has been quite amazing. The way because I'm laughing about it a bit, but I really did struggle with my husband being away. I'll give you one example, which I haven't told anybody yet, but just to really kind of put it in clear focus. my middle child, our middle child, was 3.5, and he got an infection and had to be in hospital on an IV drip. So that meant somebody had to look after the baby and the older one, and I was in hospital with them for a week. They weren't completely sure whether whether it was going to work. So it was all very, very dicey. And at the same time, Baz was on Everest about to do the summit bid. And there was a doctor on Everest taking blood samples the whole time to look at blood saturations. So from the internet, I could see Baz's blood saturations just before the death zone in Everest. And I was obviously in the room with Jago in hospital, and I could see his blood saturations. And just to give you an idea of why they call that the death zone, guess whose blood saturations were better?
Oh gosh.
The son had better blood saturations, and the father was carrying on up.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine it? Isn't that extraordinary? So that's the sort of difference 100 years apart. 100 years ago, Ruth had no idea. There wasn't telephone. There wasn't the internet. If she wanted to know how George was doing, then they sent a runner 3 days walk to the nearest telegram place, and then they sent a telegram to London. And letters took a month.
That's incredible. And it's a great segue to what I wanted to ask you about next is, knowing that it was 100 years ago and that there wasn't the technology that we have, there wasn't the communications capabilities that we have today. So there was a lot of this just waiting happening. How did Ruth cope with George's expeditions on Mount Everest?
Yeah, how did she cope? I mean, I think she just had to, which, one is very busy with 3 small children. So to give you a non-fiction answer to that, there's a man called David Pye who often climbed with the Mallorys as their third man. And he went to see her in 1921. And he said, I hope that she's busy enough to be distracted most of the day. And at night, she's so tired, I hope she just goes to sleep and doesn't worry about you. So that's kind of the only thing they could rely on. And she just tried not to make too much of her anxiety. She'd already sort of schooled herself not to do that in the war. She'd really tried not to make a lot of her anxiety, because she felt that George's mother was very histrionic and made a lot of the kind of waiting thing. But yeah, I think it was incredibly wearing, and she was incredibly brave and good at doing it. I was never that good.
Yeah, very much like almost she saw it as her post to kind of stay the course and be calm for her kids, since that was all she could do.
All she could do. That's the problem. All she could do. I mean, you can't do anything. That's the awful thing about somebody else being in danger. It's very wearing, the idea of vicarious danger. And we all have it in our lives in various different ways. When somebody that you love leaves home, are they okay in the car? Are they okay at school? Are they okay at their work? There's always a sense of that, but it's just in very sharp focus and at the very extreme edge of that experience in this case.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of a triangle going on here. So what is your interpretation of the love triangle metaphor that others have used to describe the Mallory's relationship with Mount Everest?
With Mount Everest. Well, I think he was often very conflicted about it. To start with, he said, it possesses me. Sometimes he called it that infernal mountain. So it was a love-hate, but I think he was amazingly competitive, and he was just determined to get to the top if it was possible. But in the same way, he did love Ruth, and he did want to come back alive to her and their children. So he was just very torn with that. And from Ruth's perspective, from the summit of the triangle down, from Ruth's perspective, she didn't want to hold him back, because she didn't want to be responsible for frustrating his ambition. And she didn't want the later in life for him to say, well, they got to the top and that should have been me because I'd found the route, but you didn't let me go. So it was almost like a mistress. I do think that.
Yeah, very much
Very
a
grounded mistress.
a push and a pull kind of
Yeah.
situation. Yeah.
Mm.
And so we know that George Mallory passed away while in service of his country for Mount Everest. And so, what was that loss like for Ruth?
Well, it's very interesting because to start with, she could answer people's letters and she could kind of accept callers who came to the house. And she felt that there was a sort of sublimeness to the fact that he had ascended into the clouds.
Mm.
And she had a kind of, her first maybe adrenaline reaction was that there was a sort of religious parallel somehow. She was a very strong Christian. But over time, she found that she just couldn't see people, that, she realized that she'd slightly sort of fooled herself into thinking that maybe he was just lost on Everest and then he would wander into camp and come back. And she just couldn't believe, because there was no body, there was no last letter, there was no particular closure. And so eventually it like a post-traumatic stress reaction, I think she sort of, holed up and didn't really discuss it, as because she just couldn't believe that it was real, and it was.
And in your book, you talk about the Zener affair. So what was that, and what does that tell us about Ruth's grief process?
Yes, very interesting. So Ruth talks often about courage, and sometimes that's keeping your nerve on a rock face, and sometimes that is experimenting with new things. And some very reliable, as she saw them, friends of hers sent her a message from Cornwall, where they were living, saying that Will Arnold Forster, the man in their partnership, had chanced across a séance, and that the spirit of George had a message for Ruth. And after the First World War, a lot of people were involved in séance because there were no bodies, because it was the first war where bodies weren't repatriated because it was such a huge scale. And so it wasn't considered to be, it was quite mainstream. It was quite mainstream séance. And so Ruth decided to be open-minded about it. So she went down to Cornwall and she was part of the second séance where they called up the spirit of George. And it's very difficult because I met John Mallory, their last surviving child. So John was 3 in 1924 when his father died.
Oh.
And I met him in Pretoria in 2007. And he said to me that he had torn up all the notes from the séances. So that is quite difficult because I don't have Will Arnold Forster's notes from the séances. So I can't tell you exactly what was said. But I have spoken to people who spoke to Ruth about them. And what she said is, in the second séance, she said to George, the spirit of George, "Are you happy and busy? Can you see us? And did you get to the top?" And it was yes to all of those. And then he said, "Look after Frank. He's having a hard time." And Ruth didn't know anybody called Frank. But in 1921, as part of the way of securing peace after the end of First World War, she had fostered a Czech orphan from Vienna because she wanted to make sure that the children of the former enemy didn't inherit the prejudices of their parents and therefore perpetuate war. And she felt that it was incredibly important to get it at that grassroots level. Her husband was interested in the League of Nations, which is the sort of top-down way of securing peace. She was interested in kind of educating the children not to have the prejudice of their parents. And this child was called Franz, and she had fostered him, and he absolutely loved Ruth, but he eventually went back to his biological parents in Vienna. And because Ruth heard this message from the spirit of George saying, "Look after Frank, he's having a hard time," she and her sister went to Vienna. And I spoke to Franz's widow about this, because all these people were still alive when I started researching this, which is another, amazing primary source that I try and put in everywhere I can in book. And she went to Franz's house and she made a judgment about whether he was having a hard time. I'm putting quote marks around that with my fingers. And she was a trained Montessori teacher. She was a mother. She was an aunt. She knew what she was looking for. She decided he wasn't in the right place. He wasn't being treated well. And so she suggested to his mother that he came back with her for a holiday in England. And then they said, there's also a school near us, which is being started by a relative, and we would pay for Franz to go to that school where he could learn a skill, because he was very interested in woodwork, and somebody in the arts and crafts woodwork movement is going to teach woodwork there. And somehow this was agreed with the parents in Vienna, and Franz then came to live with Ruth, and effectively she adopted him. And he was the most incredible man. And when I spoke to his widow, she said, he was endlessly kind. And that is exactly what Claire, the Mallory's oldest child, said. In fact, I'll tell you something else that I haven't managed to put in the book, because there's a lot I haven't put in the book. The book is the tip of the iceberg of my research. But Claire Mallory married a climber called Glenn Milliken. She had 3 children, and then Glenn was killed in a climbing accident. Awful repetition of history. And Franz said to her, I'll marry you and I will look after you and I will, give you a home for the children. And Claire said it was such a gorgeous offer, but actually she wanted to sort of see if she could go it alone, as her mother had. But he was just an amazing man, I think. Amazing man.
Oh, wow. What an incredible story.
Yes. I was thinking of saying that, actually, that even writing this book, I have 60,000 words that didn't fit in the book. So if anybody follows me on Instagram at kate.nicholson 2024 and asks me a question, there's so much more research, primary research to be told. And
Definitely.
I will try to get it out there.
Wow. And so, Ruth loses her husband fairly young on in their marriage. So she has this whole kind of second act. So how does she evolve and become kind of this new person?
Yes, that's very interesting, because after George signed up for the first Everest expedition in 1921, he basically didn't earn any money. So by the time of 1924, she was in debt. So she then had to move back into her family home with her father. And he was an eccentric character. That's the best way I can put it for the people that know who met him. And for example, he wouldn't let her carry on her Montessori teaching, because he said that it wasn't a woman's job to be a teacher. But she had determined with George before he died that their children should be equally educated, that the girls should be able to earn their own living decently, that they should have a classical education. And she was absolutely determined in her second act to deliver on that promise to George. And eventually her children were both very carefully educated, and they both went on to Cambridge and Cambridge University, and Claire got a first in history, in the thing we're talking about. And Berridge, the second daughter, studied natural sciences at Cambridge and then became a pediatric doctor. So in her second act, she's absolutely succeeded in promoting feminism from the kind of, from inside, as it were. She wasn't a suffragette. She wasn't a sort of a brick throwing militant, but she was very, very sort of committed to empowering women to be able to be independent.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that was influenced by her own, experiences and
Yes.
understanding and having that confidence of doing something that was quote unquote a man's kind of hobby of climbing and stuff.
Yeah, I think it probably was. I also think that her mother, May Turner, had set up the Women's Guild with William Morris's daughter, May Morris, in 1907. And that was because the Art Workers Guild was exclusively male.
Mm.
And so they set up the Women's Guild in order to allow women to be paid for their arts and crafts work, which had traditionally been considered homework. So the way I think of it is that Ruth was also an amazing embroideress and painted china, and her work was exhibited in London. So she was very artistic. But her mother empowered women through a needle and thread, and Ruth empowered them through a rope and pitons on a rock face. So I
Mm,
like that parallel.
definitely. And so, what are we hoping that future readers get from your book?
Well, I think the fact that there are such interesting women in history that have been overlooked, and it's much more difficult than looking for a man in an archive because you probably aren't going to find the same level of information. Um, so, for example, with Ruth, there's the big mystery that only one of her Everest year's letters survives. So that's why she's been really invisible till now. But in my book, I offer a theory about why that was. And I think it was possibly because when she wrote to George in the war, she said to him in a letter, I think all my letters should be destroyed, but yours should be kept because they'll be interesting in after years. And he said, even though your spelling is atrocious, which it was, your letters are like getting shafts of sunlight into the trenches, and I want to keep them. It was so lovely. And so she said, okay, I won't burn my letters, I'll keep them. But she never made that commitment to him in the Everest years. And in the Everest years, he said that when the post arrives at base camp, it's love flies in and settles in every tent.
Hmm.
That's absolutely lovely too. But she never said, I'm going to destroy your letters. And he never said, I mean, sorry, my letters. And he never said, don't destroy them. So she'd never made a promise she had to keep after he died. And so she probably destroyed all her letters except for one letter. And that is the first letter she wrote in 1924, because at that point their relationship was really under strain because it was the third time that he had asked her whether he could go back to Everest.
Hmm.
So it was the third time he was going to be in danger, the third time she was going to be single parenting, the third time that they were going to have no income. And by that stage, they were very, badly in debt. And it was just really hard. And so she, in that letter, signed off saying, I'm very sorry for being cross and not nice. But the bottom reason is that I never got enough of you, basically, not time with you. I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember exactly that quote. And I think she possibly kept that letter because people like me going into the archive would think, well, why is she apologizing for being cross and not nice? What has she done? And so, when he reacted and he said, I don't think you've been cross and not nice. So that, I think that balance, she probably kept the letter because of that. But that's the only one in the Everest years. So these women, had a tendency to self-erase.
Hmm.
And so it's really important that we bring them back into focus.
Definitely. Well, and I think too, this book kind of accomplishes two things. It helps shine a light on an underrepresented woman in history, which is a long time problem in the historical profession. But one of the things that I know that I took away from the book is a new approach and a new way to get at the story when you know that the archive is not necessarily going to have robust information about your subject. That creative way that you put together and kind of reading against the grain and picking, a variety of sources so that you could still put your picture together, I think is one of the biggest takeaways that I got from the book. And I hope it motivates future scholars to do the same.
Oh, that's just so brilliant. Thank you so much because I really love reading biography. I mean, there are so many wonderful biographies out there. And if you read it enough, you kind of, pick the bits that you really like. But yeah, I did have to write this in a totally original way. And I hope that it works. And the other thing is that I've written it mostly in the present tense.
Mhm.
I hope puts you in the picture. I want you to be able to be in the room and look around at the evidence and think, what would I do?
Mhm.
That's what I want you to take away. If I was Ruth in this situation, being asked to make this decision, should I allow him to go or not? What would I do?
Yeah. Now, where should people go when they finish your book and they want to learn more about Ruth Mallory? It sounds like maybe an Instagram account they need to follow.
Sorry, it is possibly Instagram. If you have a very long question, I have a website which is my real name, which is catherinemckinnis.com, and that has a contact form because I really want this to be a dialogue. I'm not exaggerating that is a tip of the iceberg. You know, I have so much more information that you just can't squash into a book. And so if they want to learn more, I'm very happy to share that. Just ask the questions and I will, certainly happily discuss that. So that would be great because I think these things should be a discussion. It shouldn't be just my version of, it should be our version of the invisible women in history. Yeah. But I do have a bit of a mission of bringing these people out. I just can't bear it that they're invisible. None of us should be invisible.
Yes. I love that sentiment. And knowing you just wrapped up this book, is there another project you have in the works that you can share more about?
Yes, there is another one because you see, I see it. I'm not sure that anybody else does, particularly with me using different names, but I see it as a trilogy of poles. Mm-hmm. So my first book, Snow Widow, that's about the South Pole. This is about the third pole. And the reason we're discussing it now is because it is 1924 and June, and it's 100 years since since George died on Everest. So on the 19th of June, that's my personal anniversary because that's when Ruth received the telegram that he had died. Mm. So this is a brilliant time to be discussing it. But there is also one other pole, of course. And so I need to write about that and the women around that.
Love it. And so is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you want to ensure future readers know?
There isn't, but I just think that these people are very interesting and kind of multi-talented. And I just wondered whether it might be a good thing, to read a poem that George wrote to Ruth in 1914, just to close. And if you happen to be listening to this year, just think about Ruth, receiving that telegram on the 19th of June, 1924. So I will read it. It says, to Ruth, I remember a passionate lark from fields at home, launched in the fern-spread cradle of summer air, that filled as no bird but the proud lark dare, with life of liquid sound the whole heaven's dome. But this lone mystic of Italian hills, with wings beating at the doors of paradise, not only charms my wakeful ear, but fills with fire of the one true vision my smouldering eyes. Now I am lost in listening, and the streams of pure music suspended at great height drop even to me, then, borne through quivering light, float o'er unmeasured space until it seems that the same lark winging the universal blue wakes the same trembling ecstasy in you.
Wow, very beautiful.
Isn't that amazing? He was a climber, not a poet, but that's an amazing poem, isn't it? And that is a passionate love, I think.
Definitely.
So it's a love story, really.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Pleasure.
And to all my listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of Behind Everest. Kate does a wonderful job of telling a compelling story and really places you in the driver's seat so you are right there for all of the action. So thank you again, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been lovely.
And there you have it, folks. My thanks again to Kate for coming on and sharing her insight. If you want to learn more about Kate, be sure to head over to the website at www.civicsandcoffee.com. Website is where you can see things like source material, transcripts, and learn how you can help support the show. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.